The wind came in sharp from the north that morning, dry and biting, carrying the smell of dust and frost. I had just stepped off the porch when I saw it, a small, dark shape hunched near the far fence line, where the wire curled loose against a post. It didn't move with the wind, didn't shift like brush. My boots crunched over frozen earth as I came closer, and the truth set in it was a child, barefoot, curled tight against the cold skin, pale as old paper. Before I could think on what to do, my hand was already pulling off my coat. Before I tell you what came of that morning, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a moment where one choice would change the rest of your days. My name is Reed Holston. I've been running cattle on this piece of land since the winter of '76, when my wife and I first built the cabin from logs we cut ourselves. I came to the Arizona Territory after the war, scouting for the Union back then, and stayed on because the wide plains gave me space to work without answering to anyone. Out here, a man's worth is measured in his word, the work of his hands, and whether his neighbors can count on him when times turn hard. My folks raised me on that kind of thinking back in Missouri Sunday service. Unless a storm made the river rise, share what you can spare and never take more than your share. The winters on this land don't offer much kindness. The cold settles in slow, then stays, as if it owns the place, and every mile between you and town feels longer under gray skies. Still, I learned to keep to my ways, tend the mules before breakfast. Check the fence lines by midday, keep the stove burning through night winds. My living was plain, but it was mine. The only coin that passed through my hands came from beef sales or odd hauling jobs for the trading post, and I kept clear of the railroad men and speculators sniffing after every acre near the new line. Their money was big, but it came with strings, and I'd sooner go without than tie myself to anyone else's rope. It had been 6 years since my wife passed from fever, and I'd settled into the kind of silence most men can't bear. The cabin became a place where every creak in the boards and hiss of the kettle belonged to me alone. That morning I had no reason to ride the north fence, except for a feeling that wouldn't quit a pull in my gut the way a man knows when stock has wandered or trouble's near. The sky was pale, the ground hard under the hooves, and the wind cut through my coat like it wanted to chase me home. I found the boy just past the bend where the post leans against a bleached rock. No tracks to tell where he'd come from. No smoke from a camp anywhere near. His lips were split, his fingers stiff, his buckskin shirt torn at the shoulder. I wrapped him in my coat, feeling how light he was, near weightless. The land stretched empty all around, and not a soul in sight. I lifted him up one arm, holding him close the other on the reins, and turned the mule toward home. By the time the cabin came into view, the wind had settled, but the air carried that deep stillness that falls before something changes. I didn't know then what bringing that boy inside would set in motion, only that the quiet life I'd been keeping was about to end. And the first knock on the door wouldn't be far behind. The boy stayed quiet those first days, eating what I set in front of him, drinking when I put a cup in his hands, and sleeping more than anything else. His eyes followed me across the room, not trusting yet, but not afraid either. I worked through my usual routine, mending the shed door that never shut right, hauling water from the creek, splitting enough wood to keep the stove warm through the night. The only difference was the extra plate on the table and the small form curled near the fire when evening came. On the third morning, the light hadn't cleared the ridge when the mule let out a sharp snort. I was outside fetching kindling, the air still gray and brittle with frost. Following the mule's gaze, I saw 3 figures standing on the rise above the cabin. They didn't move, just stood there with the breeze tugging at their skirts and long braids. Even from that distance I could see they were worn thin moccasins, caked with mud deer-hide dresses torn at the seams, faces raw from wind and sun. The eldest stepped forward, her shoulders squared, eyes fixed on me. "You have our son," she said, her voice steady and low. There was no threat in it, no plea, only fact. I thought of the boy asleep inside and how he'd watched the door these past days, as if waiting for someone. Looking past her, I saw the other 2 women hang back. One was younger, scanning the trees with restless eyes. The other kept close to her side shoulders, hunched lips pressed tight. I had every reason to send strangers away in winter, especially out here where help was far and trouble traveled quick. But I also knew what it was to lose someone and to follow a trail without knowing if it would end in hope or nothing at all. I stepped back from the door. "Come in," I said. The warmth of the cabin met them at once. The eldest crossed to the cot in 3 quick strides and dropped to her knees beside the boy. His eyes opened and he was in her arms before a word passed between them, his small hands clutching the back of her dress. She bent over him, her face hidden in his hair, holding on like she meant never to let go. The others stayed near the wall, watching. I poured water into a tin cup and set what I had on the table. Dried bread, jerky, a few beans. "Eat," I told them. The eldest took a piece of bread, broke it, and passed it to the boy first, then to the others. Only when they'd eaten did she look back at me. "I am Asha," she said. I gave her my name. After a pause, she asked, "Why did you help him?" I rubbed the back of my neck. Didn't feel right leaving him out there. She held my gaze for a long second. "No," she said quietly. "It wouldn't have been." That night I laid out extra furs by the stove and kept the water pot full. No talk of how long they'd stay, no promises made. I cleaned my rifle before bed as I always did, but the cabin no longer felt hollow. The sound of breathing that wasn't mine filled the space, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a threat. The next day passed in a rhythm that was new, but easy enough. Asha stayed close to the boy, now knowing him as Tojo. The younger one, Ren, kept to the shadows, eyes sharp on every movement. Tula, the softer spoken, busied herself near the window, her hands slow and careful as if noise might bring trouble. I didn't ask where they'd come from or what had happened. I figured if they wanted me to know, they'd say. By afternoon, I took to checking the north fence again. The wind swept low over the hardpan, and the sky was that pale winter blue that makes every shadow stand out. As I tightened the wire, I thought about the way Asha had spoken our son, not my son. It told me they were bound together by more than blood, maybe all that remained of a larger camp or family. I'd seen enough in my years as a scout to know what could scatter people across the land. When I came back, the smell of beans and pork met me before I reached the door. Tula stood over the stove, Tojo at her side, nibbling bread. Ren stayed near barefoot on the plank floor, her legs bare to the thigh, despite the cold. The skin on her feet was cracked and bleeding in places. I told them I had spare boots, but Asha only said, "We'll take care of our own." I didn't press it. That evening, as the hills turned blue with fading light, Asha stepped outside. She'd wrapped herself in my coat, cleaned and folded from when I'd given it to the boy, and walked down toward the dry creek bed. I followed at a distance. She stopped at a cluster of stones, knelt, and spoke words I didn't understand. Her breath rose and fell in a slow rhythm, her head bowed. When she stood, she turned to me. "You didn't ask what happened," she said. I shook my head. "Didn't think you'd tell me if I did." She looked toward the hills. "We hid him during a raid. Covered him with brush. We ran. Took days to find the place again. When we did, there was nothing left." Her eyes didn't waver, and I didn't look away. "You came a long way," I said. "Yes." Back at the cabin, no one asked for space that night. Tojo curled against Asha under the furs. Tula stretched by the fire. Ren sat cross-legged near the window, my coat draped over her knees. I stayed in the chair rifle across my lap, the wind pushing against the walls. We were all still there when morning came, and for now, that was enough. By the next day, the cold had settled harder. Frost clung to the windows, and the kettle emptied twice as fast. We all moved in quiet accord, hauling wood, tending the fire, making use of every scrap, without needing to speak much about it. On my way out to the corral, I found Asha just behind me, her arms drawn tight across her chest, the laces of her dress loose from wear. I handed her my coat again. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing mine for a moment before she pulled it around her shoulders. We worked the corral together without much talk. She moved steady her hands, sure when she held the feed sack open or brushed snow from the mule's back. I noticed she didn't wear gloves. By the time we returned, Tula had soup on the stove and Tojo was dragging a stick along the hearthstones. Ren sat nearby, turning a small leather pouch over in her hands. Later I watched as Asha knelt in front of Ren, cleaning and wrapping her feet with a strip of cotton torn from her own hem. Ren didn't speak, but her head lowered in something close to thanks. The fire snapped in the stove, and for a while, no one moved. That night, Asha stood near the door, her fingers resting on the latch. "You worried someone's still out there?" I asked. She was quiet, then said, "The men who burned our camp won't come this far on foot, but if they sold information..." I cut in. "They won't." She turned my coat still draped over her shoulders and stepped closer to the fire. "You didn't close your door," she said. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The wind rattled the walls again, and we all stayed inside, each of us, knowing without saying that whatever lay ahead, the first lines had been drawn here. The snow came in steady that week. First, a dusting that turned the hills pale, then thick drifts that settled heavy on the cabin roof. Every sound outside was muffled beneath it, the wind through the mesquite, the creak of the corral gate, even the mules shifting in the pen. Inside, the stove burned near constant. Tula kept the kindling stacked high, and the room carried the smell of cedar and pork fat from the pot that simmered most days. Asha moved with quiet purpose, splitting wood when my back was turned, checking the mule's feed before I thought to ask. She still wore the same deer-hide dress frayed at the seams and cut low across the chest, but now she layered it with my coat and a wool scarf she'd found in the storage trunk. Ren stayed watchful, rarely speaking, though her shoulders no longer tensed when I stepped near. She even took Tojo outside once, walking him around the cabin in the cold until his cheeks turned red. The boy had begun to shadow me in the yard, silent but alert, matching his steps to mine as I hauled water or cleared snow from the chicken shed. He didn't speak to me yet, but he watched every movement as if trying to learn it by heart. When I worked the trapline, he stood just out of reach, holding the broom like it was a tool he meant to master. One afternoon, Asha and I cleared the path to the shed together, shovels biting into the crusted snow. She worked without fuss, her arms strong, her rhythm steady. At one point, she brushed snow from her sleeve and caught me looking. "You used to live with people," she said, more statement than question. I nodded. "Long time ago. Soldiers first, then cattlemen, then just me and her." She glanced toward the cabin. "The wife you lost?" I gave one short nod and we went back to work. That night we ate rabbit stew and hard bread by lamplight. Tula sat sewing a tear in Ren's sleeve, while Tojo dozed with his head in Asha's lap. His breathing was even now, his fingers free of the purplish tint they'd had when I found him. I was sharpening my blade when Asha's voice broke the quiet. "He needs a father." I looked up, unsure of her aim. She didn't turn her head. "I'm not asking you for anything, just saying he needs one." I let the knife rest in my palm. "He'll grow into his own." She shook her head slightly. "Boys without men to follow either grow wild or hard. Sometimes both." I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the fire. "I'm not much for talking." "You don't have to," she said. "Just stay." Later, after the others had settled in, I sat near the stove watching the coals burn low. The wind had softened outside. Asha stepped up beside me, my coat pulled tight around her shoulders. She didn't speak, just rested her hand on my shoulder. I didn't move it away. The days slowed as winter deepened. Snow hardened into ridges along the fence line. The paths we'd cleared stayed slick and narrow. I kept to the work hauling water, checking the roof for sag, clearing ice from the stock trough. But I wasn't doing it alone anymore. Asha fell in beside me often, carrying buckets, holding the feed sack open, brushing frost from the mule's back. Her hands were bare more often than not, skin reddened by the cold, but she didn't complain. Inside, the rhythm held. Tula rationed the wood and made each burn last through the night. Ren took to organizing the tack wall in the shed. My tools hung straighter than I'd ever kept them. Tojo spent more time upright than curled in the furs, and though his words stayed few, the quiet between us felt less like a wall. Some evenings, Asha stood near the door before we latched it, her eyes scanning the dark. One night I asked, "You think someone's still out there?" She didn't answer right away. The ones who burned our camp wouldn't come this far on foot. But if they sold our trail, I cut her short. They won't. She looked over at me, the firelight catching in her eyes. You don't know that. I set the rifle on the table. I've seen men like that. They don't chase what they think's already gone. She stayed quiet, her hand brushing the doorframe as though memorizing the grain. Then she turned toward the stove. You didn't close your door, she said. I didn't answer. That night she took the chair across from me, not speaking, just close enough that our knees almost touched. The fire cracked between us, the boys breathing steady in the back room. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows in short bursts before falling still. By morning, the frost was thicker, the water in the bucket frozen solid. I broke it with the heel of my boot before hauling it inside. Asha was already at the stove, stirring the last of the pork fat into a pot of beans. Ren sat by the window, stitching leather with neat, quick motions. Tula knelt by Tojo, helping him into a wool shirt she must have cut down to fit him. It was a small thing, but the cabin felt changed. The air inside was warmer, not just from the fire, but from the way everyone moved with a shared purpose. There was no talk of staying or going. No plan beyond the next day. Yet it felt less like they were guests and more like they belonged here. Before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Asha stepped outside, pulling my coat close around her. I followed a moment later, the air sharp enough to sting my nose. She stood at the edge of the yard, looking across the snow-covered land toward the hills. Soon, she said. I asked, soon what? She didn't turn. Soon it'll be green again. Her voice was certain, as though she'd already decided where she meant to be when it happened. The thaw began so quietly, I almost missed it. One morning, as I stepped outside to check the traps, the roof let out a soft drip where the snow had started to give. The air still carried the bite of winter, but the light held a hint of yellow now, instead of silver. The ground under the drifts was not dead, after all, just waiting. Inside, the change came slower, though no less sure. The silence between us had turned into something warmer, a kind of understanding that didn't need to be spoken. Even Ren, who kept her words locked away, had begun to soften. I caught her smiling once when Tojo dragged a broom across the floor like it was a prize he'd won. Tula hummed more while she worked low and steady, the sound weaving through the cabin like part of the wood itself. Tojo was stronger now, his cheeks no longer hollow, his steps more certain. Most mornings he followed me to the barn, carrying a stick or a scrap of rope, copying whatever I did without asking why. He still didn't speak to me much, but he didn't need to. Some things were taught by watching. Asha joined us one morning, sleeves rolled above her elbows, her hands bare against the cold. I passed her the brush I'd been using on the mule. Ever done this before? I asked. She shook her head, then smiled faintly. Not like this. The mule stood patient under her touch, and soon we were working side by side. The barn smelled of straw and warm hide sunlight slipping in through the warped slats. When we walked back toward the cabin, she stopped at the edge of the yard. Snow still covered most of the land, but the path to the shed had gone muddy. She looked toward the hills. Soon it will be green again, she said. I asked what came after that. She turned to me, steady in her gaze. We don't plan to take the boy and leave if that's what you're thinking. I told her I wasn't. She nodded once. I'm not asking for land or promise. But I won't pretend this isn't something. She took a step closer, then the cold air between us narrowing. You never asked what I want. I told her she'd say it if she wanted me to know. Her voice stayed low, but every word was clear. I want to stop running. I want Tojo to grow without fear. I want Ren to sleep without a knife in her hand. I want Tula to hum without glancing over her shoulder. And I want to wake beside someone who doesn't expect me to give him anything, just to stay alive. I told her she had that now. All of it. She studied my face for a long moment before placing her hand on my waist, not to draw me in, but to anchor something between us. I want to be yours, she said, but only if you see me. My hand stayed where she had set it. I drew her in, then slow, and held her. That night, I cleared a place on the mantel, moved the old photograph of my wife to a shelf, and set in its place the beaded pouch Tula had left near the window. No one asked why. They understood without saying. When the lamps went out, Asha lay beside me for the first time under the same furs. Her arm rested across my chest, her skin warm against mine. No one slept by the fire. No one kept watch at the door. The boy slept sound in his corner, and for the first time in years, the cabin felt whole. The next days brought more rain, and the snow began to sink into the earth. By late afternoon, steam lifted off the roof, and the air smelled of wet pine. Birds returned darting low over the yard, as if they'd been waiting for their cue. Inside, things had shifted in ways that were small, but certain. The furs stayed folded instead of scattered. Ren patched the cracked window with a square of oiled canvas. The larder was neatly stacked. Tojo now had a woven mat of his own, near the stove no longer just a borrowed space. It was then I noticed how much I had slowed, not from age, but from watching. I saw the way Ren no longer kept her knife under the blanket, the way Tula spoke more when the wind rose, telling bits of her past. I saw how Asha's touch lingered on my arm, in passing how her hand rested on my chest in the mornings, without hurry. She didn't ask for more, but I could feel the shape of it building. One evening we stood outside as the sky turned the color of rust over the hills. Asha leaned on the fence, her hair loose over her shoulders. The dress she'd worn since arriving, now mended and cinched with the leather belt I'd given her. She didn't shy from my eyes when she saw me looking. The roof will need mending, I said. She tilted her head. So we'll be here long enough for that? I gave a short nod. She looked out toward the mountains. You think any others made it out from our camp? I waited a moment before saying, some maybe, not many. She took a slow breath. We lived. That should mean something. It does, I said. She turned to face me, her expression steady. I want this to be more than shelter, Reed. I want roots, not just survival. I didn't look away, then stay. Plant them here. She stepped in close, her hand on my chest, her voice low. Then I want to share your bed. I didn't answer with words. I bent to kiss her, not rushed, but certain, her breath warm against mine. That night we stayed close under the firs, the fire throwing its light across the walls. Her hand guided mine without haste, her body fitting against me like it had been waiting for that place. When it was done, she lay with her head on my shoulder, tracing the scar along my ribs. I don't need promises, she whispered. You've got more than that, I told her. In the morning, Ren passed by the doorway and saw us still curled together. She didn't speak, only set a jug of water on the table with a quiet hand. Outside, the first shoots of green were breaking along the fence line. Inside, something had taken root that would not be pulled up easy. By mid-spring, the hills had traded their gray for yellow wildflowers, and the creek I thought had dried for good was running clear again. The mule was shedding in clumps, birds nested under the eaves, and the earth gave underfoot instead of breaking. In the yard, Tojo followed me from the corral to the shed, hauling short planks in his small arms, like they were worth more than gold. He spoke now in short bursts, half in English, half in Apache, each word careful, as if it might break. Wren kept busy without being asked, mending tack, tightening hinges on the barn door, burin, setting my tools in a tidy row that put my own order to shame. Tula had staked a plot behind the cabin, turning the soil with steady patience until it was soft enough to take seed. She hummed while she worked the sound, carrying even when the wind shifted. Inside, Asha moved with the same quiet confidence she had in winter. But there was a weight to her now. That wasn't there before, not weariness, but something held close. She cooked when she felt like it, worked when she didn't, and always made time to touch my arm in passing, or rest her hand on my shoulder as she stepped by. Nights she lay beside me under the firs, her arm across my chest, her breathing matched to mine. One afternoon, I set about building a second pen for chickens behind the barn. Tojo stayed at my side, holding nails, handing me the hammer when I reached for it. I showed him how to line up the head with the wood, how to feel the weight before driving it in. By the time the fence was set and the coop covered, the boy's hands were dirty, and his grin was quick and wide. He looked up at me. "Can I call you father?" I didn't speak right away, just met his eyes and felt the tightness in my throat. "You already do," I told him. I went inside and came back with a small oilskin pouch I hadn't opened in years. From it, I took my old Union belt buckle, the silver worn smooth. I pressed it into his hands. "Was mine. Yours now." He held it like it was more than metal, then nodded once. From the porch, Asha watched her hand resting on her belly. It wasn't showing yet, but I'd noticed the way she moved slower, more careful, her palm drifting there, when she thought no one was looking. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. That night, after the boy had gone to sleep, I sat with Asha near the fire. Wren and Tula spoke in low tones by the stove, their talk turning to next season's planting. Asha leaned against me. "My people believe new life comes when the earth is finished grieving," she said. I kept my hand over hers and asked, "What about people? Do we get that too?" She turned her face toward mine. "You tell me." I kissed her, slow and certain, the way a man does when he knows the answer without words. In the days that followed, the work felt lighter, though no less to do. The fence lines held, the pen stayed mended, and the creek ran steady. Tojo carried his new buckle everywhere, tied to a strip of leather at his belt. Wren's smile came easier now, though she still kept her eyes sharp. Tula's garden rows stood straight, each one a small promise of what was ahead. Each evening, the light stretched longer across the yard before slipping behind the ridge. And each night, I felt the quiet in the cabin change, not the silence of winter, but the stillness of something settled. I didn't know then what would come to test it, only that for now, we had the kind of peace you notice most when the wind drops and the air holds still. By late spring, the days had turned warm enough that the air coming off the creek smelled of pine sap and wet earth. The hills were green now, dotted with yellow blooms, and the garden rows behind the cabin were already pushing up with shoots. The mule grazed in the corral tail, swishing lazily at flies, and the chickens scratched along the fence line in the new pen Tojo and I had built. Life inside the cabin had settled into a pattern that didn't feel borrowed anymore. Wren still spoke little, but her sharpness had softened into something steady and reliable. Tula's hands were never idle, sewing, cooking, tending her garden, and the sound of her low humming drifted through the rooms like it belonged there. Asha moved through it all with quiet assurance, her presence tying the place together without a word. Tojo stayed close to me most days, eager to be where the work was. I taught him to set a post straight, how to check a hinge for sag, and how to walk the fence line without missing a break. He listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, his words came careful and sure. One afternoon, while checking the far pasture, I spotted a loose stretch of wire where a post had tilted in the damp ground. Tojo held the tools while I worked, passing me the hammer, when I reached out without looking. When it was fixed, he asked if he could try. I stepped back and he drove the last staple home with 3 solid strikes. As we walked back, the sky to the west had turned the color of lead, and the air held the smell of coming rain. We made it to the cabin just as the wind picked up, rattling the loose board on the shed. Inside, our Asha was at the table mending a tear in Ren's skirt, while Tula stirred a pot on the stove. The smell of beans and salt pork filled the room. After supper, we sat near the fire as the rain drummed steady on the roof. Asha leaned against me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Tojo lay curled on his mat, the silver buckle I'd given him resting beside his head. Ren sat near the window, sharpening a small knife, the scrape of the whetstone even and slow. Tula hummed to herself, her foot tapping softly against the floorboards. It was the kind of night that felt safe, the kind that made you forget how quickly the world can change. But I'd lived long enough to know such quiet didn't last forever. When the rain eased, the wind shifted, carrying a faint sound that didn't belong to the hills or the creek, the dull rhythm of hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, coming up the trail. Ren's head turned first, her eyes meeting mine across the room. Asha straightened her sewing left on the table. I stood and moved to the door, the boards creaking under my boots. The hoofbeats grew louder, the sound of a single horse. I lifted the latch and stepped onto the porch. Through the dim light, a rider emerged from the trees, his slicker dark with rain, the brim of his hat pulled low. He didn't push the horse hard. Each step was measured like a man who'd come a long way and meant to be heard before he was seen. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, the horse shifting under him. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying over the wet ground. I didn't answer right away, my hand resting on the frame of the door. "Got word you've been keeping company out here," he added. His gaze slid past me toward the lights spilling from the cabin. Behind me, I could hear the faint rustle of movement, Asha near the fire. Tula setting something down Ren's boots on the floor. I stepped forward, closing the space between us, just enough to make it clear this was my ground. "What's your business?" I asked. The rider shifted in the saddle. "Might be talk better had inside. But you'll want to hear it." His eyes were steady, but something in them told me whatever he'd brought wasn't the kind of news a man could leave for morning. The rider swung down slow, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He kept a hand on the reins, eyes on me like a man weighing his words. Water dripped from the brim of his hat onto his slicker, running down in dark streaks. "Name's Sheriff Doolin," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Got word from over Prescott Way. Thought you'd want to hear it yourself." He glanced toward the cabin where a flicker of movement showed in the lamplight. "Best we talk inside." I stepped back, pushing the door open for him. He left his hat on a peg water pooling beneath it and moved to stand near the stove. The heat put a shine on his damp coat. Asha stayed near the table, her hand resting on Tojo's shoulder. Ren leaned against the wall by the window, and Tula set a kettle on without a word. The sheriff's eyes moved over each of them, then back to me. "Couple of riders came through Holbrook last week. One of them was talking about an Apache woman and boy living out this way. Said they were looking to claim them back." Ren's arms crossed tight. Asha's grip on Tojo's shoulder firmed, but she didn't speak. "Who?" I asked. Doolin shifted his weight. "Man called Weller. Hired hand to a rancher east of the San Pedro. Claims the boy's kin to a man in his outfit. Had another fella with him, didn't catch the name. They're headed this way." The only sound was the kettle beginning to hum. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me, waiting. "How long?" I said. 2 days, maybe less if they ride straight." Tula poured hot water into a mug and set it in front of the sheriff. "You think they'll come to the door polite?" she asked, her voice even. Doolin shook his head. Men like that don't bother with polite. Figured you'd want warning. My badge won't mean much if they aim to take by force. I'll ride back to town tonight, send word to Judge Ellery. But he's 3 days out on the circuit. I nodded, the weight of it settling like a stone. Appreciate you coming, Sheriff. He drained the mug, set it down, and pulled on his slicker. I'd keep a lamp burning and a rifle close, just in case. He left without looking back, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the wet dark. When the door shut, Asha came to stand beside me. "We won't go back," she said quietly. "No one's taking you," I answered. That night we set about making ready. I checked the Winchester, cleaned and loaded it. Wren oiled the hinges on the doors, making sure they swung quiet. Tula moved supplies from the shed into the cabin: flour, salt-dried beans. Asha sat with Tojo, speaking to him low in their tongue, her hand brushing his hair back from his eyes. We slept in shifts, the fire kept low. Near dawn, I stepped onto the porch. The rain had cleared, leaving the air sharp and cold. Down the trail, the first pale light was spilling over the ridge. Wren joined me, her hair pulled back, rifle in hand. "We'll see 'em before they see us," she said. I nodded. "Stay to the trees when the time comes." By midday, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of dust. From the high point above the pasture, I spotted 2 riders moving steady along the trail from the south. Even at that distance, I knew they weren't drifting through by chance. They saw the cabin and slowed. One raised a hand, calling something I couldn't make out. I walked down the slope, stopping just beyond the fence line. The taller one, broad-shouldered with a dark mustache, leaned forward in his saddle. "We're here for the woman and the boy," he called. "Ain't looking for trouble if you hand 'em over." "Not happening," I said. The second man laughed, a dry sound. "You think you can keep what don't belong to you?" "They belong to themselves," I answered. The taller one's hand slid toward his hip. I didn't move, but from the edge of my sight I caught Wren's shadow among the trees, rifle steady. "You've got one chance to turn around," I said. "Take it." For a moment, neither moved. Then the taller man spat into the dirt. "This ain't over." They wheeled their horses and rode back the way they'd come, dust curling in their wake. I stayed there until they vanished over the rise, the sound of their hoofbeats fading into the wind. When I turned back, Asha was standing in the doorway, Tojo beside her, his small hand gripping hers. "They'll come again," she said. "I know, I told her. But so will the judge." 2 days later, the sound of hoofbeats came again. But this time, it wasn't the dust-raising gallop of trouble. Judge Ellery rode in with Sheriff Doolin beside him, both men moving at an easy pace. The morning sun threw long shadows over the yard, and the air carried the clean smell after rain. We met them at the fence line. Ellery swung down stiffly, his boots pressing into the damp earth. He greeted Asha first, then rested a hand on Tojo's shoulder before looking back at me. "Sheriff told me what happened," he said. "The law's clear, no one can claim folks as property. Weller and his partner won't be riding this way again. We've already seen to that." Asha's shoulders eased, though her hand stayed linked with Tojo's. Wren stepped out from the porch, and Tula followed, wiping her hands on her apron. The judge looked at all of us in turn. "If you choose to stay here, you can. This is your home as much as his." Asha met my eyes, her own steady. "We'll stay." Inside, the fire crackled while Ellery signed the papers. Nothing fancy, just words on worn parchment stating their right to remain free and unharmed. When he handed the document to Asha, she took it with both hands, folding it carefully before tucking it away. We shared a simple meal at the table, fresh bread, beans, and coffee. No one said much, but there was a quiet weight lifting from the room. When the judge and sheriff finally left, the sound of their horses faded slow and steady, not like the threat that had ridden off days before. That evening, I stepped out to the porch. The sky was a pale wash of gold, the kind that comes before the first stars. Asha was in the yard with Tojo, showing him how to stack kindling. Ren and Tula were tending the garden, their voices low. Looking at them, I knew this was more than just a roof and walls. Out here, family wasn't always the one you were born to. It was the one you stood beside when the wind rose and the trail got hard. The West has a way of testing a soul. It strips things down to what matters: a safe place, to rest a hand you can trust, and the will to stand when others would turn away. We had all been tested, and we were still here. If you've ever known that kind of loyalty, the kind that stays through the long nights and hard miles, you'll understand why this place and these people will always be worth defending. And maybe when you think on it, you'll remember the faces you'd ride through the dust to protect.